interactive session. I've brought Andy on board because he's a expert in this area. So really, Andy's going to run you through a presentation, and it's really about us being able to interact with you, in the Q&A, and you can ask any questions on any topic. Even if it goes outside of the scope of this, we're happy to answer that as well. So, look, thanks for making the effort to log in tonight and to listen to us. It's really important, and we understand the importance of this from your perspective. So hopefully what we share tonight is of some value to you. So I'll hand over to Andy. Thank you.
Thanks, Pete. And yeah, it's disappointing we can't make it up. Promise we'll get up there at the nearest opportunity we can, because I hear there's some really good things going on at the demonstration farm. Terence gave us a little bit of feedback that you're interested in some of the bigger picture stuff, not just what Fonterra is doing. So what we thought we'd do is sort of zoom out, if you like, a little bit to some of the big global drivers, to things that are influencing how Fonterra responds and how we as dairy farmers in New Zealand have to respond. And then, so we'll sort of zoom out first and then narrow it up a bit later on in the presentation, just in terms of how that influences Fonterra's strategy. So that's the way we thought we'd run it. So yeah, just keep your chat questions going along the way if you remember them, and Hamish will, and we'll collate them. So look, I think it's probably worthwhile saying, actually, what are we trying to solve for at the moment? Because it's a moving goalpost in terms of the global situation. And we've probably never found ourselves in a position where what we're actually trying to do is feed 9 billion people with the same raw material that we fed 6 billion people with. So that's a big enough challenge in its own right. But on top of that, we're expected to have the environmental footprint. We're expected to respect human and animal rights, probably about equally. We want to get paid more for doing that, because we know we're going to have to invest more in our farms in order to deliver. So we want to get paid more. Luckily we are. But on top of that, we've got to meet the nutritional needs of a population on one hand that's aging, and has a big focus of that aging part of the population on health and well-being. So that means it's got to be accessible to that age group. But on the other hand, we've got these affordable nutrition objectives that are really important. And the affordable nutrition is essentially around feeding children in developing countries. So we've got to deal with both ends of the spectrum. If we just go to the next, Hamish, can you just flick on a couple of slides? Have we got the slides up? Started that. Yep, sorry, I should have. So if we just go to the third slide in before the map, Hamish, slide 3. Thank you. I thought it was just worthwhile putting up a summary. As a lot of you will know, the United Nations has got about 23 sustainable development goals, which are actually quite confusing to remember them all. But if you want to summarise them, and you'll see they line up with what we've just said, is that 1, they're trying to solve for feeding 9 billion people. 2, they expect social equality, and this is a big issue in places like Africa, Bangladesh, those sort of countries. 3, climate action. Climate change is the hot topic globally at the moment, and everybody's getting into gear. And 4th, improved environment. And one of the challenges we've got as pastoral farmers way down at the bottom end of the world is that there's a very influential group of people. A lot of them live in New York, actually, but in the Northern Hemisphere, who believe that plant-based production is the cure for all of those 4 challenges. And there's actually some fundamental reasons why that's not going to be the case. If we just go on to the next slide, I just thought worthwhile putting this next slide up. So you don't need to focus on the detail, but if you look at, where all the red bits are, that's where the world is going to get really hot relative to 1890. So that means the temperature relative to 100 years ago is sort of up to 10 degrees higher. And the green bits are where the relative rise in global temperature is pretty muted, like less than half. And if you look at what the significance of that is, you'll notice that New Zealand's green, and but of South America's green, and you know some of the South Australia, but essentially what we would call the grain belt of the world, which is 40 degrees north through Chicago, right through the Ukraine, where it's interesting at the moment, and through that Eastern Europe belt is really hot. Now, the reason that that's quite significant is that there's effectively the grain belt of the world is getting hot, and the pastoral belt down where we are is not getting hot to the same degree, even though you might not feel that way in Northland over the last 6 weeks. So, but we know that, 95% of the world's dairy production and beef production comes from feedlots, which are very dependent on grain. So the challenges in the Northern Hemisphere are a hell of a lot more than we've got. So even though we might feel a bit challenged, then it's still, we're still good. If you go to the next slide, Matt, whoops, you've gone back one, go forward one, that's it. Food access, and again, don't worry about the details so much, except to say that if you look at the dark bits of the world, that's where people can't afford a healthy diet. If you look at the light bits of the world where they can afford a healthy diet, we don't typically have trade access to those light bits. If you look at the sweet spot, if you look up into China and Southeast Asia, we've got trade access into Asia, and they want our food. So, the theory that we only want to feed the wealthiest 40 billion people in the world is a bit of a fallacy, because actually we don't necessarily have access. So that's quite important, because Fonterra, that's why Fonterra has become more Asia-centric rather than more Europe-centric. And it wasn't long ago, in the early 90s, where we still had a view that the future was selling into Europe. So if we just go on to the next slide, we'll just go through a few sort of key assumptions. Whoops. Next one, slide 6. Yep, key assumptions. So as I just noted, the vast bulk of the world's beef and milk production is produced on grain-based rations. So that's quite different to what we face. On the other hand, the global plant protein supply, think soybeans, in North and South America is strongly dependent on a combination of glyphosate GE technology, and is actually a monoculture, which is more vulnerable to disruption from pest and disease and chemical resistance. And we are seeing a bit of a backlash against monocultures and some of the regenerative agriculture discussion. But really, if you come back to fundamentals, it talks about, you really think risk management, integrated farm systems, rather than trying to do the same thing every year for year in, year out. If you go corn, soybean indefinitely, sooner or later you get some system disruption. So if we go to the next one, next slide. So the global, go to the next one, Matt, if you can. The global demand for protein, carbohydrate, and essential nutrients will rise with increased population. That's just a fundamental. But what that actually means is that we're going to have to waste less food or stretch what we've got out more, because we've actually got 9 billion people to feed rather than 6. Now, in practice, that means that the diversified diets, i.e. more meat and milk in the developed, less meat and milk in the developed world, will offset the demand for protein in the developing world. And that's really what we're seeing at the moment in the market. So, you're seeing your big expansion of plant-based in the developed countries. But if you look at a discussion around essential nutrition, which includes micronutrients, it's a much more complex debate than just how do we feed the world with protein, carbohydrate, and sugar. And if we go to the next slide, and this slide's come out of the Reddit Institute in Palmerston North, And there's a little much, I'll just describe roughly what you're looking at there, because otherwise you'll get, again, bogged in the detail. If you look on the y-axis, on the bottom axis there, you'll see the relative contribution to the global supply for macronutrients. And by macronutrients, we mean sugar, protein, fats, and carbohydrates. The micronutrients, which is what we think is the limiting amount, is up the y-axis on the left there. So therefore, if you want to feed the world and have them with the right nutrition, you want to actually look to the top right of the graph. So if you look at what's out there, well, in the grain world, it's wheat and rice, as opposed to things like potatoes and stuff like that. That's starchy roots. But if you look where dairy is, it's way up the top on right, equal with vegetables on micronutrients, and it's pretty well out to the right even on macronutrients. So that's the sweet spot where we think we can play globally. If you want to just see what's down the bottom end, not that good on macronutrient and not that good on micronutrient: sugar, soybeans, palm, and for those of us that like a beer or a wine beverage. So that's the stuff for pleasure, not for need. So I think that actual graph says a lot. We have got a really good product to not only feed the world, but if we componentize the core bits out of it, we can add into some of that stuff on the bottom left that can help feed the world, i.e. soy, but actually doesn't have enough nutrient in it. So if we just go on to the next slide, around key assumptions, it looks like increasingly synthetic food technology is here to stay. And it's a fact that consumers will accept GM if synthetics are to grow in volume. So if you look at Impossible Burger, for example, the young people that are eating lots of Impossible Burgers in the US, and they've delayed their launch in Australasia because of COVID. But if all the young people in the US eating Impossible Burgers, by definition, aren't worried in the slightest about GM in their diet. So, if that's going to grow, then the GM debate will rapidly come less of a debate. But what we know is that synthetics have got a very high cost of production, but that cost of production is rapidly dropping. So eventually they'll become competitive, but they're not currently competitive. So a key question I think we've got to ask in the market is, are we looking at synthetics as an additive or synthetics as an alternative? And personally, I'd say we're absolutely looking at synthetics as an additive, because if we've got a very high value component in milk or meat products, then we might be able to add that into a synthetic product somewhere else in the world to feed the world. If you just go to the next page, so this componentization of raw material is probably going to be a key to supplying affordable nutrition and selling some really high value product to the ones that can afford to pay for it. I.e., if we just want to send whole milk powder in the form we have to people that don't need the fat component out of it, they just need the protein, i.e. skim milk powder, then they're not going to pay us what we need. And when you've got approaching $5,000 a tonne whole milk powder, people might be willing to pay for a component of it because that's what they need. So the key issue really, and this goes to the core of Fonterra's future strategy that we're working on now, is how do we define food as a medicine, i.e. it's going to help your health, food for nutrition, help you live, food for well-being, makes you feel good, and food for pleasure, which makes you feel damn good, and you're probably going to pay a lot more for it. So I suppose beverage comes into that category, doesn't it? But historically, because there's been lots of milk, we've probably mixed all those things together. But if you want to eat something whole, you know, those consumers are going to pay a premium. Doesn't matter whether it's a whole glass of milk, a whole kiwi fruit, a whole egg, a whole fillet steak. It's all the same thing. But if we're going to earn that big premium, then we're going to have to earn it, and we're going to have to be able to verify the underpinning claims, which comes sort of down to the trust part of it, which I'll come to in a minute. So part of that is if we have to or need to differentiate ourselves from our very good overseas competitors, and some of those competitors, remember, source product out of New Zealand as well, then firstly, New Zealand needs to be able to describe much better what we collectively stand for and market those values. But then Fonterra needs to do that to differentiate ourselves from international competitors that source product out of New Zealand.
You've gone on mute, Andy.
Sorry, we jump. Yeah, if we just go to the next slide. If you look at all of that stuff, then there's some huge implications for processing, form and function, for capital allocation, for farm systems and system leakage, which is what this group particularly I know is interested in, for brand management, for product positioning and for infrastructure positioning and funding. And we take half an hour to go through all of these. So I'll just pick on one or two of them because part of this stuff is what Fonterra has been diving pretty deep into over the last couple of years. So if we just go to processing, form and function on the next slide, then there are key advantages to processors and marketers with the ability to switch product lines and markets in order to be responsive to customer demand. And that's really shown up over COVID. If you're a one-trick pony, you can't respond to changing markets, and it's a bit like a wind. You know, you've got to change the sales settings to what blows. And really, Peter, I think this year what we've seen is a big premium to being able to split whole milk powder into the fats, which go to food service, which are high value, and into the skim milk powder, because the premium for whole milk powder is top relative to those, isn't it?
Yeah.
So that's really a key. Otherwise, you're stuck with one product mix that may not be in fashion. So infant milk formula would be a good example of a highly fashionable product for the last decade that's become very difficult this year. Processors with the ability to extract high EBIT components from their raw material supply, and that applies to meat and milk. It's not just milk products, but as increasingly we can take. So in the milk space, a good example I'd give you would be phospholipids, really high value component in the medical science area for people that are deficient in phospholipids. And phospholipids are, for obvious reasons, attached to the fats. In the meat space, I could give you an example of the blood products. You know, what do we make from blood that we collect from cull cows? We make serum. Where does serum used in vaccination and vaccines? So, you know, how do we extract value from stuff that used to be sold whole or used to go to waste? Moderate gearing has become quite a big issue because, you know, how do you reduce your overheads and make sure, firstly, that you keep your cost advantage in a global sense, and secondly, that you retain independence from the banks. Once you become at the mercy of your financiers to make strategic decisions and you can't afford to make the right strategic calls, you get in trouble. And we got a bit close to the wire there 3 years ago, Pete, didn't we? So, you know, that's one of the reasons we've de-geared Fonterra, to get away, you know, make sure we're in control of our business. And then scale, because there is a valley of death between a good idea that's profitable and getting it to scale so that you actually really do make profit. And in order to manage risk and execute diversification strategies, you've usually got to have a really good P&L behind you to be able to afford to invest, because sometimes on the stuff you can be wrong for 6 or 7 years before you're right. And there is that valley of death that if you don't get there, good idea gets wasted. And then the last thing around that is committed capital, because if you haven't got capital, you haven't got stability. And that's one of the key advantages of a co-op. So if we just move on to the next slide around capital allocation, it's a fact that capital only comes from retained earnings, debt, recycled assets, and new investors. And of course, co-ops can't source external capital from new investors without diluting supplier ownership. So effectively, we have retained earnings. And if you pay 100% dividends, you don't retain any earnings. Debt, and we got a bit close to the wire there, or recycled assets, and we're much more interested in recycling assets, Peter, aren't we, to things, be prepared to sell something that's good, but not good enough to invest in something that's much better. But look, it's not just co-ops that have to have challenges. I mean, divisions of major corporations all fight for their share of the capital, and that's a rolling maul of what's better this year. Growth companies often become overgeared because they can't raise money quick enough for their growth. And the share market, as we know, can be a very fickle master. You're always looking at your share price every day, and you don't often make the right strategic decisions because you're worried about the share price. So really, when you look at that, probably a key thing for us is that the benefits of collective capital cannot be underestimated. So if we go to the next one around farm systems and system leakage. So this is sort of relevant, very relevant. So there's a few things here I just thought we'd call out. New Zealand farm systems, because we're mixed farming generally, and we're pastoral based, much less fragile, but less productive than most of our international competitors. So, who are really based on monoculture type systems. Our soils are actually more fragile because a lot of them are based on alluvial and low soil soil, because we're young, we've got young soils, and they're lower in moisture holding content. But in actual fact, they've got more organic matter, and we've got massive water resources, which give us a huge advantage. We also, because we're an island, we've got a temperate, moderating sea climate. You might not think that lately, but we do. And we do have a very low dependence on imported feed. And if you think about Europe, 70% of the feed going into milk and meat and beef production in Europe is imported from North and South America. You put a little bit of pressure on from the Ukraine if there's a few tanks rolling across some wheat paddocks, and a little bit less grain comes out of the Ukraine, and you can see how dependent some countries the world are on imported feed. We don't have that dependence. We do use some imported feed, but in a crisis, we could get away without it. So just looking at how we leverage all of those sort of attributes and minimize vulnerability. If we go to the next slide, what I thought I'd do here is just frame up a few questions rather than answers, because everybody will have a different view of this, but here's some questions for us to think about. Firstly, have we become over-dependent on cheap artificial N at the expense of clover fixed nitrogen, which is free? And as we know, the price of urea is more than doubled. Secondly, have we become over-dependent on imported feed, which is mainly PK, but not exclusively, at the expense of New Zealand grown supplement? So would our farm systems be a bit less vulnerable if we grew more product at home that we could utilise on the farm, whether it be, I just mentioned there, grain, lucerne, maize silage, fruit waste, just some of the things. And that might be a 10-year migration, not a 1-year migration. It's just a matter of thinking about how vulnerable we are, unlike our international competitors. Another question is, do we need gene editing and cisgenics? That's where plant genes go to plant genes, as opposed to transgenics, where you've got animal genes going to plants. Do we need gene editing or some variation of it to enhance the natural attributes and resilience of our pasture plant plants if we're going to maintain our ability to feed the world and reduce environmental leakage. And a good example of that would be the AgResearch ryegrass plants that have got 20% more fat in the leaf and double the root mass, which means you could halve your leakage of phosphate and nitrogen because it's intercepted from the root, the bigger root mass. Next slide, thank you. Hamish, we've got, will we need to adapt our plant breeding and animal objectives to account for new attributes? And just a couple there, just to throw in the pot: heat tolerance, which is probably a topic of the day at the moment. Cows don't like being hot at night. And urinary end, which there's quite a lot of plant breeding, animal breeding going on there. For example, how do we reduce the urea level in our nitrogen level in the urea urine of the animal? Next question: can we make dairy farming more people friendly as a greater proportion of the industry are actually employees, not owners, and have got changing lifestyle ambitions? And I'm seeing down south at the moment, Lincoln University have got a trial running with milking 10 days and 7, which was based on trial work here in NZ and Lincoln did last year. And quite a lot of people are adapting it because they quite like the idea of milking once a day on Saturday, Sunday. How do we resolve real and perceived perceptions around animal welfare? And one that's on our mind there is, how we think about calves. How do we optimise calf utilisation? But what does good look like? And as you know, Fonterra has just come out and said, well, we do not support on-farm slaughter. We think we want calves to go to food production somewhere in the supply chain. Next slide. How do we best harness our water resources to increase productivity and reduce environmental footprint? If you go to the NGOs or go to Wellington, they all think that as soon as you irrigate, you're going to increase the environmental footprint. That is not necessarily a given, but it would be fair to say that we've been lazy users of water historically, as has the world. But there's no question that we can, strategically use water to reduce our environmental footprint. And I know you've got some small projects on the go in Northland. How do we leverage more value per dollar from dollars invested in science to assist in the solutions? And Fonterra is the biggest private sector science entity in New Zealand. And it's a case of how we use not only our dollars, but also government dollars to work here to get a lot more bang for buck out of this. There's some critical roadblocks to progress that if we knock them over, we could actually get a higher productivity from a lower footprint. And the sort of the follow on from that is, are some of the roadblocks actually in our own minds, or are they real? But that's what science is about. But we've actually got to think outside the square to see what we can do next. Just a quick one slide, the next slide there on brand, just to get us thinking a little bit about one of the things that when you go around the world, New Zealanders are generally trusted for a whole range of reasons. We're not sky doers. Other than the last week, we don't tend to protest too much. But we do have quite a good global reputation. So the pyramid of trust starts with, the New Zealand brand, and it migrates up through the sector brand, which is agriculture, the industry brand, which is dairy, the company brand, which in our case is Fonterra, the regional reputation, which in your case is Northland, then the market niche you're trying to go to, it might be organic, might be A2, might be something else, and then the farmers. And one key question that I've had a lot of young women asked me over the last 5 years, just in random conversations, is if I go on social media and talk about what I'm doing, am I wasting my time or am I achieving any effort? And the reason I put that pyramid up one day, just in a scribble, was actually positive social media comments that go to the top of that pyramid reinforce the brand, because you're giving proof to everything below it that we're doing a good job. On the other hand, bad social media comments can undermine the brand. And that's why we've got to be really careful, but we need to be strategic in how we think about it. And of course, the reason I put those stuff on the side is that the stuff at the bottom relates quite a bit to the license to farm or the public brand, of agriculture and dairy. Think about the Dirty Dairy brand that Fish and Game thought up a decade ago, 15 years ago. That undermined our license to farm. The stuff in the middle, the Fonterra brand, I mean, most of our work is with other customers, so it's B2B. But who sees the social media, whether it be on Instagram or Facebook or whatever, from the farmer on the farm? It's actually another consumer. And if we just think about how all that goes together, we could be a lot more strategic. So if we just go to Fonterra's strategy and how we talk to the opportunities and strategies that have been sort of there in a global sense, well, we want to use our collective capital, effort, knowledge, global networks, science capability, and risk management ability to solve some of those issues. So that's what we want to do. But there's also some things that we're not here to do. We're not here to conquer the world. We're not here to be international farmers, because we're actually not very good farmers. We're an institution. We leave the farming to the farmers. We're not an advocacy body. That's FEDS. We're not a policy body. That's Dairy NZ. We just want to do a bloody good job at what we do. But our core job is to take your product, manufacture it into top products and sell it for the best possible money we can, and then return that to the farmer the best way we can. And I think one of the issues when Fonterra was 92% or 94%, whatever we started at, Pete, of the global, of New Zealand dairy, is that we got sort of called into international trade diplomacy, advocacy, policy. So it wasn't that clear. So we've probably got an easier job now than the early guys in Fonterra, because we can be more clear what we're not. So the cooperative difference philosophy uses a pull strategy in terms of walking towards change, incentivizing change rather than using a stick. We want to utilise the farm source model to support producers who have to adapt their farm system to meet those future needs, so we can be support. And we want to deepen our research and ability to differentiate, extract and create value from those components we talked about. And the key thing about our pasture-based milk is it's very nutrient dense. So if we just go to the next slide. So we then want to leverage our ability to create value from adding our milk components to nutritional products that potentially uses other raw material. And that could be anything. It could be plant-based. So think rapeseed oil, think linseed oil, think coconut oil. We use those now, but they're mainly out of Australia. There's other product uses palm oil, for example, for the Middle East, but that comes mainly out of Australia. Think synthetics. How might we think about that in the future? Some of the stuff's way in the future and some stuff's close. How do we deepen our existing links with global consumers who are customers who are looking to solve those nutrition, health, human welfare, biomedical challenges? And these are big customers. These are your Abbotts, your Nestle's, these big FMCG companies. But they also want to do all of that while reducing the footprint. And if we can help them reduce their footprint, we become absolutely core to their strategy. Yeah. Lastly, targeting selected customers who are prepared to pay for dairy products purely for well-being and pleasure. And those are the customers who are going to pay a big premium because they like to, not because they have to. So last slide. So thinking about investing both capital and effort into environmental solutions that can reduce the tax on our activity, because we actually don't want to just think about the environmental stuff as a tax on what we do. We want to think about how we turn it into a global leadership position, because that's how we premiumise our product. That's how we get more money for what we produce compared to our global competitors. How do we leverage our scale and knowledge to improve our competitive cost advantage relative to global competitions? Fonterra's scale here is mission critical. And so we're really thinking about that. And we're also interested in using our marketing, supply chain and risk management skills to monetize these factors into both milk price and earnings, because that's our core reason for being. And I think the hidden gem inside Fonterra is our CPM, or risk management division, who really offset risk. And if I give you a good example of the difference between meat and milk, Fonterra is already hedging, way out into 2023. So we're locking in some of the current exchange rate advantage, and we're locking in deals with customers, a year to 18 months out. Whereas in the meat industry, we can't really do much more than a few weeks out, because we always know if we get it wrong, if we hedge and we get it wrong, we could be overtopped by competitors, and then they get the product and we don't. So even though, the meat companies are doing a damn good job, and just for disclosure, I'm involved with ENSCO, we cannot manage risk. Doesn't matter whether you're a co-op or a private company. We cannot manage risk very far out in the meat industry, whereas we can in dairy. I suppose you can in kiwi fruit too, Pete, because you've got a dominant position.
Yeah.
So that's enough. That's enough from us. Happy to open it up for questions.
Yeah, thank you very much, Andy. Listening to the presentation, it's actually very appropriate. But one thing that's brought to my mind is that through COVID, it's been a long time since we've actually had the contact with our cooperative in this sort of presentation, and I myself certainly enjoyed it, and looking at some of that bigger picture stuff. And hopefully the others have found value too. So Kim, have you got any questions that you want to kick off that have come through the chat?
Yeah, I'm not sure if everyone can see them, but there's been a couple texted too. So first question is, guys, are you happy to make these slides publicly available?
We don't have a problem. No.
Okay. Awesome, thank you. And one from Nathan here. So he's interested in the theme, I guess, of catering for what the consumer wants to get on the basis that they'll pay a premium. But his question, more in the context of the NDDT, is how do the targets of 2030 and 2050, I'm presuming he means emissions targets, affect farmer profitability, assuming that Fonterra's need to perform as a business at farm gate level will have to increase, it's a really long question, for its suppliers, shareholders, will have to increase in response to raising the cost of premium production. Does that make sense or not really? Did that question make sense?
There's probably a couple of themes. If I take one and then Pete might think about the other side. I mean, one of the things we're doing in Fonterra is, we don't have Fonterra here to actually say we can't do things. And, we've signed up to a set of international agreements, which, we could debate or not debate, but we've got targets there. And we have the ability with our collective effort, not only our in-house science team, but the stuff we do internationally, the links we've got internationally, to look for breakthrough technology that could enable us to get an and, not an either or. So very much at the moment, I think our discussion is an either or. But, when you actually concentrate on, the human brain concentrates on getting some stuff done, we make far more progress than we think. And so I'm a natural optimist personally, but from what we're getting some visibility of and how these good science brains and inventors are going, we could have some real breakthrough stuff that would give us an and.
Yeah, I guess, we've sort of articulated a view around being carbon net zero, so we've got to think about the net zero part of that. Nestle and other customers, Danone, they've set targets. So while we think about consumer preference in consumer demand, and that's not one thing either, because they'll have different perspectives around, you know, the brand values or the product value that they're looking for. We can't lose sight of our customers. And if we're able to deliver, well, we can position ourselves to be, like Andy said previously, really important in their supply chain, and that's a real value to us. Now, it's really interesting if you look at some of the geopolitical that's playing out now, and we think about the fine balance globally between supply and demand in food. So if you look at dairy right now, what we're seeing, whether it's, you know, slight decrease in New Zealand, Europe off target, US down, mainly driven by feed costs in the US. Oil pricing's high. You can see the demand pressure that's on at the moment, and there's no real inventory build around the world. We're also seeing that right through the product range. So we're seeing, while cheddar and some of those products still lagging whole milk powder, fortunately they're traveling together. So that's really interesting how fine that supply-demand balance actually is. If you think about another, I'll give you another issue to think about. Think about Russia's control over the natural gas to the EU and pricing of that, and the potential impact that could have on urea production, and the potential impact that could have on rice and grain crop production globally, how the balance could be tilted very quickly. So I think we're entering a paradigm that's really quite different to what we've ever seen in the past. And some of the aspirations around climate change may have to be moderated as economies move forward and understand they can't afford to feed themselves. So there's a high risk here that, you know, as a planet, we could potentially starve populations, which would lead to a lot of global unrest. So there's a lot of interesting stuff playing out right now globally that we need to be tuned right into. Consumers won't want to pay for this. Let's be blunt about it. So, you know, how do we, so then you see if you look at demand coming off, it's really interesting how value, you know, how that drives price pretty quickly. And, you know, some customers or some consumers are going to fall off as we go through that cycle. So it's just a really interesting supply demand balance right now. I don't think we should kid ourselves that consumers want to pay more for this stuff. They actually don't. They want it for free. And then they want to live their lifestyles and they don't care about their carbon footprint. They want us to take responsibility. The other really interesting thing which we saw in Scotland was the pressure, because of the pressure on fossil fuels and many economies' inability to deal with that issue, they're all turning on agriculture, which I thought was quite an interesting shift in the last sort of 12 months. So I think, you know, this thing's going to keep moving around, and but there's a lot of moving parts as well. So from our position, you know, we need to have a customer focus and a consumer orientation. So we need to be heading in the right direction to try and meet customer requirements. If we don't do that, ultimately we don't have a business.
Thank you, Peter.
I wonder, this has sort of been texted and a couple of people have asked, you know, whether we underestimate the competitiveness from poultry and pigs. Just looking at that slide that had the macronutrient, micronutrient, they were pretty high up in that right-hand corner. You know,
Yep.
Thinking about how much food is wasted in the world and how easy it is, relatively easy compared to dairy cattle, to feed that wasted food, particularly to pigs, but potentially poultry as well. And thinking about young people will quite happily eat chicken, but they won't eat red meat. You know, whether that, just how Fonterra sees the risk from those sectors rather than the plant-based sector.
Well, you've probably got a basic, one of the reasons, with one of the key advantages, pig and poultry and fish farming too, which I would say is even more, yeah, could more go into that space, is that feed conversion efficiency is huge, you know, compared to a ruminant animal. by definition.
Yeah.
So we're always going to be a premium product. And therefore, if you're going to be a premium product, we have to be able to extract more out of our product. And I think that's the key issue. We've been a bit lazy because we've never had the technology, but we've never needed to dive deeper into our raw material. And so a good example of that would be, we used to send, it's not that long ago, 20 years ago, in the meat industry, we'd send whole carcasses out. Even 10 years ago, we would send one carcass might go to 3 markets. Now one carcass would go to 20 markets. And in milk, we would just do one thing with it. And now we're extracting all of these, the micronutrient extraction. Phospholipids was the example I gave you, but there's, we've also got, in the protein space, for example, things like whey that used to go to waste is now being extracted. So we've got all of this stuff. We are going to have to be a lot smarter because on basic principles of feed conversion efficiency, we're dead meat, so to speak.
Yeah, so sort of leading on from that, it was stated that New Zealand dairy farming is less productive than overseas. How is productive defined? And is this a real problem that we need to work on? Any ideas without compromising other needs such as low carbon footprint and high water quality?
I saw your question flash up there, Ina. Yeah, I think there's a classic, let's say the traditional metric of productivity. If you're looking at production per cow, for example, our cows are doing 4,000 litres and the Dutch are doing 12. By that metric or production per hectare, they're a long way ahead. However, if you want to look at what's our nutrient density, if you look at nutrient density at one side and carbon footprint out the other, we start to get quite competitive. And of course, we're not saying, I think we've got to be really careful in New Zealand to say we're not better than the rest of the world. I mean, if you want to have an argument, and my wife's family are Dutch, I could easily have an argument with them about who's the better farmers, the Dutch or the Kiwis. I mean, that's a futile debate. It's just that we're different. So rather than saying we're more productive or less productive, it's just saying we've got a different product and how are we going to find the market niche for that?
Yeah. Okay, so next question from Alison. Are you able to share what the next 3 years looks like if farmers are investing in environmental and longer term sustainability, which farmers are certainly talking about, which is good.
A short answer is a good Fonterra payout because you're going to have to reinvest a hell of a lot of it on farm.
No, yeah, I guess the environment we're operating in, who can tell what it's going to look like in the next 3 years, like we talked a bit about that supply-demand balance and understanding global inventories and what's playing out in the US. Right now their feed costs are really high and they've got a record cull cow count as well at the same time. So they're not able to respond because they're not making the margins at the moment. So, it's hard to predict the future, even for us to pin down the next 12 months, let alone the next 3 years. I guess, we've also got obligations. So, New Zealand has obligations under the Paris Accord that we have to meet. The government's put into the Carbon Act. They're looking for 10% reduction in methane emissions. That's locked into legislation, but that's across the sector. It's not necessarily dairy. And, you can see it playing out already with what's happening with land, price of land suitable for trees, which has jumped phenomenally in the last sort of 3 years. Where does it come from? Where does the reduction come from? I think dairy is best positioned in all of that to come through that. I guess, the real challenge is how do we need the technologies to actually get real reductions without dropping production at the same time. That's what we're really focused on. How do we drive this through efficiency and actually getting more from less, not less from less, you know? So it's a real challenge, and it's hard to give a really clear answer, you know, and we're not trying to be evasive, but we can't just spell out what that looks like in the next 3 years, you know. And for all of us as farmers, we're looking at our own farming operation going, well, what am I going to do, you know, to move the dial on this stuff? And, you know, New Zealand's not just looking, while we can sit there arguing that we have the lowest emissions per kilogram of milk solids globally, and if we reduce ours, then potentially, you know, that goes up somewhere else, so the planet's worse off. They're not interested in that. They're interested in New Zealand actually reducing at the same time. It's a bit like with, you know, our energy sector, where we're really efficient in terms of renewable energy, in our electricity sector. We don't get any credit for that. So our baseline's already established, and we've got to bring it down even further. So it's pretty confronting from a government and a policy perspective as to what they do about it. From a Fonterra perspective, you know, we can have a big impact with the coal that we take out of our supply chain. It is a very immediate impact, but we've got physical constraints around how quickly we can do that. So it's sort of everywhere across that supply chain. I don't mean to be evasive, but even for us on our own farming businesses, we're sitting there going, well, where are the tools? You know, and that's what we've got to be investing in to try and help farmers get through this.
I think the harsh reality for us is that we have to embrace the uncertainty, because as you've seen the last 2 years, and that's been the case forever, I mean, there's no inside knowledge here. Peter and I sitting here today couldn't put our hand on our heart and say we know what the milk price is going to be in 2 years' time, because there's just so much uncertainty. But you have to, if we walk towards that, I mean, Fonterra's job as a co-op, which is that collective effort, collective capital thing, is to actually try and unbundle some of those uncertainties and mitigate them on farm. So we're trying to do that in the supply chain, but also on the farm. And that's why our research capability, I think, is going to be something that defines, you know, differentiates Fonterra from a lot of other people.
Have you seen a change in attitude, I suppose, from the government or factions within the government that were quite anti-agriculture in the last 2 years as a result of the primary sector propping up the country?
Yeah, I think there has been a change in attitude. I think the relationship that we have with governments probably as good as it's ever been. 4 years ago, you know, it was non-existent, to be blunt. So we've come a long way in that regard. They understand the issues, like they understand the tension and the potential impact on overseas earnings and how important agriculture is. You know, and the governments come and go as well, you know, and I guess, you know, are we challenged by the direction of travel or the speed of travel? And the issue, I think the issue, and this is one of the challenges we have from our sustainability advisory board, is this just goes faster. It doesn't go slower. And it's not necessarily the government, it's corporations, it's consumers, it's a global issue that's coming at us like a steam train. And, you know, it's our ability to adapt and respond to that that's going to define us at the end of the day. So while there's angst around, you know, I guess from an emissions perspective, I don't think they're out of whack with where the global trend is. In fact, you could say that we're laggards in that regard. The water quality stuff, I think, is a different issue that sort of, I think that is driven more philosophically and potentially goes beyond consumer expectation in some regard. But I think the emissions one's a different story. So the two are coming at us. I think from an emissions perspective, our objective is how do we turn a perceived threat into an opportunity? Like if we just see everything as a threat, then we go like a turtle, we put our head in the sand and we get run over. How do we adapt? How do we change? How do we respond to that? And it's real, you know, and doing nothing's not an option. That's the bottom line.
And I look on the water quality one, just to toss something in there. There's no doubt we've got to do a hell of a lot better than we've done.
Yeah.
But you see multi-generations of people, you know, doing things, you know, that when you look back even 20 or 30 years later, you think, what the hell were they thinking? You know, I mean, Chicago put all its effluent into the Great Lakes originally, and all that's why they set all the meat companies up on the banks of the Chicago River. Because that's how you got, in the old days, that's how you got rid of effluent, whether it be sewage or meat plants or milk plants. You know, back in the 1980s, we were putting wastewater straight from, cow shed effluent straight into streams. And you think, what the hell were we thinking? But we actually didn't know any better. We're now dealing with underground, you know, we didn't know 15 years ago, we didn't really know about diffuse effluent from urine patches. Now that we're concentrating on the urine patch, we can do something about it. So I've got a great confidence that once you understand the problem you're dealing with, you can actually solve it. So it's just a matter of being able to do it in the right order.
Yeah.
Yeah. Just slightly different tack on the question here. Where do we see market access into Africa in the short to medium term? Rising incomes, young population. Is it a market we're actively looking into?
Within now.
Yeah, we're quite big in Africa, but I think you can't, and this is where the market's changed. When you say there's a market in Africa, it's an affordable nutrition market essentially, but you say, so what is the market in Africa? It's essentially a protein market because they've got sufficient carbohydrate because they grow grain. May not be good grain, but they grow grain. So if you're in Ethiopia, Congo, all of that Northern Africa area, they grow grain, and so they've got sufficient. What are they missing? They're missing the fat component of milk, and they're missing the, essentially, most critically, protein. Now, our skim milk powder is protein. So we've got big international customers that buy the skim milk powder and they add fat back into it, which obviously once you've taken high value butter and cream cheese and mozzarella and everything else out, can't put that back in again. So they put plant-based oils back in, or whatever those oils are, from various parts of the world. So, you know, it's a matter of actually targeting the nutrition to what they need, not what we want to sell them. And we see that as a growing market because whoever asked that question is right. I mean, there's a lot of people there. And I think the thing that, you know, people when they're having a coffee on a Sunday morning in Auckland forget about, and when they're debating the social issues, is that if people in those countries don't get sufficient nutrition, they either pick up a gun or they walk to a place where they can get nutrition. And that's why there are 100,000 people on the Polish border. And that's why you'll see people migrating out of other countries like that. You know, they'll walk for thousands of miles to get to where the feed and the jobs are. And so of all of the big dairy processors in the world, doesn't matter whether it's the Dutch, the Germans, the Americans, the Irish, ourselves, you know, the South Americans, if we all say, well, you know, we don't care about that part, we haven't got a product that we can deliver them in an affordable way, we'll have social disruption. And you can see how nervous people are now about geopolitics, whether it be in, you know, the Ukraine or Taiwan, China, or wherever it happens to be, doesn't matter, all around the world. So we do need stable markets to have a market.
Yeah, and get paid.
Yeah.
Fonterra as a brand, does the cooperative see its own brand as a product of itself and New Zealand farmers, or a product of New Zealand provenance? Is New Zealand provenance something we need to leverage better as a cross-industry venture to gain more value? That's quite topical.
An initial reaction people have one. I mean, I think it's an end-to-end, you know, of Fonterra. If the New Zealand brand is crap, it makes it very difficult for Fonterra. But if Fonterra stuffs it up, then we undermine the New Zealand brand. So I think we're codependent.
Yeah, and I guess the Fonterra brand, you know, you got to look at your brand architecture as well. So you got New Zealand milk products, you've got consumer brands like Aniline, Anchor, products like that, and those different sub brands have different brand values. You probably find the provenance story is a much bigger deal in Asia and a much lesser deal in places like Europe and Africa and places like that. So then it's about, you know, the target audience that you're looking to go after. But certainly we are looking to leverage that more going forward. Probably something that, you know, could have been done better in the past, but certainly New Zealand provenance and potentially pasture fed and the benefits of that and the value that's in that is going to be more highlighted going forward, for sure.
Just think about the fact that if we're going to componentize our products more and extract more out of what we have, it becomes harder to monetize the provenance because we're just the high value piece
That's right.
of a lot of other things. And that's the B2B. And that's where our strategy is going. It's a very small component of the world that you can leverage the provenance. And we will do that. But as we componentize, then it's a much bigger picture. Still a higher EBIT, but EBIT and provenance don't always go together.
Yeah. Which one's more risky?
You don't want all your eggs in one basket, do you? And depends on what you define as risk. I mean, consumer sentiment can turn on a dime. I mean, the more sticky your customers are, the better off we are. And so some of those big international FMCG companies that are, you might argue, are more dependent on Fonterra, we're dependent on them as well. So there is a codependency. So sticky customers are always less risky.
Mm.
I think so. We've got to be careful not to just focus on one aspect. So when you look at brand values or what a consumer's value, there's a whole bunch of stuff in there like convenience. You know, we don't talk about indulgence as a brand value, but you know what we do in food service in China, a big part of that is indulgence. So where do they see the value? Now, provenance is a subset of that, and certainly you can get a halo across the top, but it is a subset. It's not, you know, for a lot of consumers, they're looking for different things in a product, not just, you know, that provenance thing. So, you know, it's just about getting that balance right, I think.
A head of cream cheese on top of a pint of beer is definitely in China is definitely indulgence feed, isn't it?
Yeah. So, you know, we just got to be careful about that and understanding that really well.
And just along those lines, I think this question came in by text. You mentioned that infant formula had dropped off quite a bit. Can you just explain that a little bit more?
Well, there's a couple of reasons for that. One is the Daigou channel. So, you know, the channels through which, you know, A2 as a brand and other companies and even us ourselves through Hong Kong with Anmum were getting product into market, particularly we're talking about China here. And then also the Chinese push for, you know, buying local and the tightening up of registration around, you know, canning or manufacturing facilities, you know, providing product into China. So that's all tightening up. So that model's changing. It's changed quite quickly over the last 3 years because some of that's come about by COVID and the impact on travel, but it's also been affected by policy. So,
yeah, I think if you just think back to that brand, and you know, to the trust pyramid that we put up, I think that's quite relevant to that question, because why was the Chinese market really keen on sourcing infant milk formula from New Zealand? Doesn't matter whether it's from us or our competitors, and that was, you know, a lot of what was behind our competitors. Actually, because they didn't trust infant milk formula from China. and they didn't necessarily trust breast milk. The reality is, if you go back to work quickly, you were using infant milk formula. But over COVID, so the reason they didn't trust Chinese infant milk formula was there's a series of scandals, some of which New Zealand was on the fringe of, where they said, well, we trust it from New Zealand more. But over COVID, the pendulum swung a bit to say, well, actually, if you source it from, China is free of COVID, New Zealand might be, but nowhere else in the world is, you can trust it from, if it was produced locally. And so that pendulum swung to, actually, we can trust our own milk, our own infant milk formula. And so, these markets swing, but it always sooner or later comes down to trust. It's not that we've become less trustworthy, it's just that actually the supply chain issues, can I trust that if I order this product, it will get there on time? And generally from Fonterra, we've done very well in that regard. But has it got COVID in it or not? There's a whole raft of things that people think about.
So there's still a way to go in terms of the New Zealand infant formula, and even out of Australia, that segment being successful again in China. It's going to take time and, some degree of change for that to re-establish itself. Can it be re-established or not? I'm not sure. And what's the nature of distribution around that in China, and so can they recover their premium position or not? There's a big question mark over there.
And you can't pick this stuff 5 years out, necessarily 10 years out. So that's why you want to be a diversified manufacturing entity, where you can mix and match your product mix to suit what the customer wants.
Yeah, and relatively quickly, I guess. Terence, that's the end of the question. So not sure if you wanted to open it up, or we've sort of done pretty well, I think, on time.
Yes, so if there's anyone who wants to ask a question directly, please feel free to do so now. Just unmute yourself and pipe up, or put your hand up. There's one down. Somebody's got their hand up. Hamish, I don't know whether that's been removed now. It's just got iPhone on it, but okay. Yeah, the COVID thing's interesting, isn't it? Because it's changed the market perception, and hence had quite an impact on the product. What other impact has COVID had positively for us, and that you could see swing the other way?
Supply chain. So, and this is sort of going back to my previous life as well, a lot of companies that evolved into a just-in-time supply chain strategy with the cheapest container they could buy at spot on the day. Now the companies took a more strategic position around long-term relationships and investing and helping assist shipping companies partner with them over time. And I know at Zespri, we committed to a 10-year contract with Fresh Carriers in Japan for reefer shipping. Now, reefer shipping, you get a better outturn of product, but it costs you more. And there's a lot of tension in the industry around cost. The other extreme, we had Taiwan, where there was no inventory build and market, and you're just in time, and that was the cheapest supply chain, but it was the most fragile and highest risk one as well. And I see, with Kotahi, and our relationship there is really, really powerful. And we've been able to also contain costs because of the nature of the relationship. And if you look at Maersk's earnings for the half year, it was north of 4 billion euros. They had their best year ever. Now, there's been an element of gouging going on through that COVID period, but we've been able to maintain reasonably good pricing because of the nature of that relationship. So, supply chains are a series of relationships, and people partner with you along the way, and everyone needs to benefit from being part of that. I think taking long-term views around that sort of stuff, I think there's really valuable lessons out of all of that, hugely valuable. So, and that's exposed a lot of companies hugely. And, it's given us, a relative degree of strength because of our ability to deliver. And that's been powerful for us.
Well, it's a fundamental fact, I suppose, that you can't, if you're a retailer, you cannot make money unless you've got the product on the shelves.
That's right.
And, we've been able to deliver deliver on the shelves. And that's just one thing, by the way, where, we want to get cash out to farmers as quickly as possible. But if you think about the fact we have a seasonal grass curve, seasonal supply curve, but we still need to supply product to our customers during June, July, August when we're not manufacturing it. And so that's why, we need to carry some inventory at the end of the year, no more than we need to, but we need to carry inventory to make sure we're dead reliable for those customers when we don't produce it. Because if they go somewhere else, they may not come back.
Penny, you've got a question. Can't hear you.
Oh, sorry. I'll have
We got you now, Penny.
okay, yeah, I have to. My volume's not very good on this computer, sorry.
How are you, Penny? No, we can hear you well.
Oh, good, yeah. Nice to see you guys and good updates. Thanks. I was just thinking about the questions that you asked in one of your slides about reliance on or over reliance on N and imported feed, and then the one about gene editing, and wondered what your answers were. And if New Zealand farmers or dairy farmers take those on, or if their answers are yes and maybe to the three, production will drop, you'd think, at least to some degree. And we're seeing that on our DEM farm at the moment, that NDDT or NAF farm, with our no input or low input farm, the production's right down. So how is Fonterra going to handle that? And interested in your views on that in imported feed and gene editing. Thank you.
Probably just give a personal view, because we're still working through from a Fonterra. We don't have a policy, if you like. We're just working through how we might strategize it. And you have to ask the questions before you come up with the answers. So we're trying to ask the hard questions first. But if I just give you a personal view, well, it's not a view. Here's a way to think about it. Firstly, cost. One of New Zealand's competitive advantages is we have a much lower cost of production than the rest of the world. So do we want to spend $1 to make 3, or do we want to spend $1 to make $1? So if you can grow, if you can generate nitrogen from a clover plant, which costs you nothing, why would you do that compared to chucking it on out of a truck? So that's the first thing. Secondly, I think risk management. How do we, if you've got a lower cost structure, but also if you're not so dependent on the feed coming in a truck or a ship from offshore, then how do we think about that? If you had a supply chain disruption, a biosecurity disruption, or a political disruption, if you were sitting there in parts of Europe at the moment, I'd be a bit nervous about whether my wheat's going to come from the Ukraine or not. But, we could be saying, if we were bringing soy from America or palm kernel from Indonesia or whatever, all of those things can happen compared to the paddock of maize grain grown on the paddock next door, where you just chuck it in the trailer and bring it home. So I think about it from a risk management point of view. And then I'd say these aren't problems about the next 12 months. We're trying to think about, because we're a co-op that's intergenerational, we should be thinking about these things over a 30-year view. 30 years ago, we didn't use imported feed in New Zealand, and we didn't use imported nitrogen. And so what's the next form of how we might solve these problems? Because we probably can't even think of what that solution is. And if you just go to the first principles of gene editing and say, well, or GM, say, well, if we can produce 20% less carbon and intercept double the amount of nitrogen phosphate that leaks past the plant root system, which is a ryegrass plant only goes 300 mils deep, compared to say 600 or 700 or 800 mils deep, and you've got some deep rooting plants in one of your trials there, then and it's nutrient dense. How might that look? Well, I suppose the end answer is the consumer will tell us in a decade's time. Will those customers say, we value your product more because of its low environmental footprint and its high nutrient density, or will we value it because it's GM free? We don't know the answer to that yet, but we need to have the solutions for the customer as they come up. So my view would be that, you know, we just have to think differently because some of the stuff's just been too available, too easy, and we've got to go back to some first principles.
And it's interesting because, you know, we're looking at that and that sort of applies, but as agriculture is being targeted as the greenhouse gas creators, I suppose, politically, all the solutions are leading to lower production currently, which would indicate that the prices are going to lift, which would indicate it becomes more profitable to use these synthetic fertilizers and intensify. So at what point do you jump off the wheel and make that bold change? Yeah, that's.
But is it about jumping off the wheel, Terence? Because in your experiment, you've sort of taken a potentially more extreme case, and I'm sort of, you know, there's always somewhere in the middle where you moderate what you're doing. So you've got a 190N example. We don't use anything like that on our farms, and we try to push out clover as much as we can. But we're not zero nitrogen at the other end either. And then in terms of supplementary feeding and how you balance your farm system, I think this is an evolution, not a revolution. So it'll be a little bit, you know, I'm sure we can model what that looks like. I guess, you know, this is all about balance. It's a bit like the rhetoric around regenerative farming and who controls the dialogue or the messaging around what is regenerative farming. And I think we've got a role to play in that. And we're already exercising ourselves over that. But this is all about balance. It's all about moving forward, but not just throwing the baby out with the bathwater either. So I think, you know, that's sort of how I'm trying to look at it. But certainly it's really interesting, the whole cisgenic sort of tools that we aren't able to use now, which I personally think is a real education issue here, because people just go, oh, it's GM, it's genetic modification. And I actually think if we're really serious, personally, if we're really serious about climate change, they're the most powerful tools that we can use to address it and still feed people at the same time. Also, globally, there seems to be a trend in this younger population where that's less important to them than the climate is. Okay, so it's about relative importance. Yet to our generation, or you know, people north of 40, say 50s, 60s, 70s, they have different values that they struggle with that type of technology. So then it comes back to, you know, market acceptance, and that's a New Zealand story problem. It's not something that we're going to necessarily be the deciders of, you know. That debate needs to come out into the open and be had, because the tension is potentially between, you know, climate versus these types of values that we adhere to.
One other thing I'll just chip in there. I don't think, Terence, and I'm thinking back to your question too, Penny, I don't think we necessarily have to accept that lower footprint means lower production. And I'll just give you a couple of easy examples. You know, one of them is in the gene edited space, and the other one's just basic nitrogen use. You know, the clover that AgResearch and PGW seeds are developing it up. You know, the GM clover, for example, that's protected protein. It can get right through the rumen and digested in the gut, and the rumen is what produces the greenhouse gases. So if you can get the stuff past the rumen and into the gut where the animal can absorb it, then, you know, you've got, you know, a hell of a lot more productivity per kilo of feed eaten. The other example I'd give you, and I mean, it's it's against ourselves, as some of you know, I farm in Canterbury, when 10 years ago, when the clover root weevil ripped through Canterbury about 2 years after you guys, we had no clover. We got up to 320 Ks of N typically. That was a very common amount of nitrogen. And we've spent the last decade trying to build clover content back in pastures, in order to get our nitrogen down. Most people have dropped back to about 230, 240 was about the average kilos of N. And then David Parker came along and said, no, that's no good. You've got a limit of 190. But farmers are really resourceful people. So we've now got a whole lot of stuff going on. People are looking at liquid N and they're adding it with ProGib, and we've actually got, for example, in the mixed pasture, you've got your fescue trials there. The clover content's typically more than double the clover content in the ryegrass. And if you produce double the amount of clover, you produce double the amount of N. And so suddenly we're finding that actually we haven't lost any pasture production, and we're down to about 130, 40 Ks of N using smart technology. So there's a whole lot of things I think that, we can do. And, as Peter said, I think your trial there is sort of at both ends of the spectrum, but I think you'll end up coming to somewhere in the middle. And that's the great thing about trials, this sort of systems-based work you're doing on that research station. It's more about asking the hard questions and then working out, over 10 years where the answers are. And I'm sure it won't be the current answer, but you'll see a whole lot of good stuff coming down the line.
Yeah, and that's correct. And one of the things when we started our low emission trial is that we said that in 5 years' time it will not be the same as what we started with. There will be technologies introduced and that sort of thing and tested, and and let's see where that goes. So correct, thank you. So any other questions before we close? No, okay. All right, thanks very much, Peter and Andy. It's certainly been a very insightful evening, and there's a lot of information that came through on that'll no doubt be digested as we think these issues through. Next week we've got Susan Kilsby, who's the agricultural economist for ANZ. So that's next Wednesday night. So that's our next session. And then going forward, we'll have John Roche, MPI advisor, and who knows the farm quite well. And then we'll also be having our the following week our NAF science update. And look, even though it's early stages and we haven't completed a year, there are some numbers coming through, as Penny alluded to. But yeah, it'll be interesting to see how these trials pan out over the next few years. So Peter and Andy, thanks very much for the support that you guys give us, not only in these events, but on farm. And we do have a good working relationship with Fonterra. You guys are all over our milk at the moment and looking for any issues that might develop out of these alternative pastures or whatever from a manufacturing point of view. And we share quite a bit of data with you guys to make sure that there's no red flags that can turn up like we had in the past with PK. So just with that, thank you very much from our team, and and for tonight.
Thanks for the opportunity. We really appreciate it. Sorry we couldn't be there in person.
Yep. And hopefully there'll be time for that.
Yeah.
Thanks for making the time, everybody.
Thank you.
Okay.
Everyone
Good
next
luck
week.
with
Thanks
good luck
everyone.
with the farm.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks.